My mom abandoned us for her new husband's family and moved overseas. A decade later, she came back begging for my brothers. I was 14 the spring everything on Birch Street went black with smoke, and my brother Vince was 9 and still carried his glove to school like it was a passport to a better country. That year I could measure time by Graham's rules about food, because he had rules for everything worth chewing and a few things that weren't, like how cereal should be leveled with a butter knife and how milk should be poured to a line he drew with a marker on the glass. He wasn't our father, and he never pretended otherwise, except when it helped him lecture. And even then he did it with a grin that felt like a receipt being stapled to your shirt. Nora, who used to laugh in the kitchen before work, had learned a new smile that lived between her cheeks and never touched her eyes. And she wore it whenever Graham counted chicken strips like coins and announced that extra mouths mean extra bills. We walked home together that Thursday because Vince's teacher asked if I could grab him early, and the wind kept pushing grit into our socks, so every step whispered like paper. At the corner, I smelled something wrong before I saw it. A sweet tar stink mixed with damp fabric. And then I saw smoke climbing behind the roof like a dark flag rising from the yard. For half a second I thought grill, because Graham liked to perform with tongs and a beer, but this smoke wasn't coming in puffs. It was pouring and folding over itself like storm clouds. Vince started jogging without saying anything, and I followed because he didn't know any other ending than a door being opened by someone who loves you. We dumped our backpacks by the cracked bird bath and rounded the fence, and the heat slapped my face like we'd walked into a dryer full of coins. In the middle of the grass, a metal ring held a bonfire built from our lives, and the flames ate shirts, notebooks, picture frames, a lopsided trophy Vince won for most improved batting, and my cleats that still had infield dust from last season. Graham tipped a red gas can and laughed through his teeth like he'd just discovered an easy way to get rich, and Nora stood near the patio with her phone held high, as if she was filming a parade, not an execution. The stepkids, Piper and Sloan and Dylan, watched through the slider with sticky popsicles and tried to look brave, which made them look cruel without understanding why. Graham turned and saw us and smiled a smile that didn't show teeth, but showed everything else. And he said we had appetites like grown men and wallets like ghosts, and how he was done footing debts that didn't belong to him. He called us strays, and the word landed like a leash snapping shut, and he gestured toward the street with the can to show us the direction for county intake. Nora swung the phone toward us like she was catching a surprise party reveal, and she said they were flying to Denmark in the morning and that we'd manage fine because kids are resilient when they stop lying to themselves. Vince made a sound I still hear before thunderstorms, and he asked where we were supposed to sleep tonight, and Nora shrugged like she was trying on a sweater she might return and told him that problem stops being hers after the plane takes off. The neighbors' kids were in their yard pretending to ignore us while recording every second through gaps in the fence, and their camera lenses felt like cold coins pressed under my tongue. Graham leaned toward the fire and tossed Vince's glove into the flames with a flick of his wrist like he was skipping a stone, and I watched leather buckle and curl while my brother choked on air he could no longer swallow. Something settled inside me then, not a shout but a lock clicking, and I took Vince's hand and told him to remember the smell and the noise and the words because someday we would need them exactly as they happened. We left without looking back, because looking back would mean asking for a different ending, and that ending had been burned on purpose right in front of us. We walked until the houses turned into a park that always seemed bigger from a bike, and we sat on a bench that had a plaque for a stranger who loved birds, and Vince cried like a kid who just learned that rules can be bent until they break. I counted what we had, which was nothing but the two of us, and I tried to imagine what it would cost to turn nothing into a place to sleep and wake without flinching. After the sun slid behind the library roof and the air cooled enough to breathe without tasting ash, I told Vince we were going to try one person who might answer even if he was drunk, because sometimes drunks answer to feel important. Our dad's brother lived across town and used to bring bowling shoes to Thanksgiving, and his name was Toby, and Nora always called him a cautionary tale, which meant he might accidentally be a lifeline. We didn't have bus money, so we waited until a crowd of high schoolers jammed through the rear door, and we moved with them like minnows cutting behind bigger fish, and nobody noticed two boys gripping the rail like it was their last good idea. Vince pressed his forehead to the fogged window and watched the city slide past like a movie someone forgot to score, and I rehearsed how to ask for help without sounding like I was trading one bully for another. Toby's building smelled like hot dust and old pizza, and the buzzer panel had more broken buttons than working ones, and I didn't know his unit anyway. So we started at the top and worked down, ringing names we didn't recognize until someone with smoker's breath finally said Renee is coming. When the door creaked open, a woman with a messy bun and a purple sweatshirt looked us over like we were selling magazines that didn't exist, and I said our names fast before she decided to close anything. Up close I could see she wasn't mean, just tired, and she waved us into a hallway with carpet that felt like stepping on damp bread, and we climbed until my legs ached worse than any practice I'd ever run. Toby was on the couch in a shirt that might have been white once, and the table was a still life of bottles and 1,000 lost coins, and he blinked at us like someone had changed the channel on his life without warning. I told the story 3 times because the first time he thought I was making a joke, and the second time he forgot why we were standing in his doorway, and the third time he picked up his phone and called Nora, who didn't answer, and then Graham, who did. I could hear Graham's voice through the cheap speaker calling us liars and saying we'd run off because chores felt unfair, and then the line clicked dead like a trap shutting, and Toby stared at the phone as if it had asked him for rent. Renee pulled him into the kitchen, and they hissed at each other with the faucet running for cover, and I kept Vince on the couch because sitting looked like a choice and standing looked like a mistake. After a while, Toby came back and said we could stay on the floor for a couple nights until he figured something out, and Renee put down 2 thin blankets that smelled like warm laundry, and Vince curled against my shoulder with the hiccup breaths that come after crying too hard for too long. I lay there counting the cracks in the ceiling and telling myself not to forget the crackle of our shirts burning, because forgetting would be letting someone else write the story in our place. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried and a television laughed and a siren slid past like a whale singing through concrete, and I finally closed my eyes because morning was going to insist on arriving whether I was ready or not. Living with Uncle Mark was never meant to be permanent, but days became weeks and weeks became months. The 1-bedroom apartment felt smaller every day, Mark and his girlfriend Clara in the bedroom, me and Liam on the living room floor. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did any sense of home. 2 months in, Mark lost his job and blamed us for the stress. That night, I overheard Clara saying she never agreed to raise someone else's kids, hinting that maybe social services should take us. I lay awake, terrified we'd be separated. The next day, I skipped school and searched every store with a help wanted sign. Most laughed at a 16-year-old asking for work, but a small convenience store owner finally offered me cash to stock shelves after school. It wasn't much, but it kept us there a little longer. Mark's resentment grew. He started drinking earlier, saying we were just like our father, burdens. I gave him most of my earnings for rent, saving only a little. Liam did his homework at the store while I worked. The owner sometimes slipped him snacks out of pity. 6 months later, Clara gave Mark an ultimatum, us or her. I came home to find our bags by the door. But when Mark left, Clara admitted she didn't really want to throw us out. She had a sister, Paige, with a finished basement and a separate entrance. If I handled yard work, we could stay. The basement was cold and damp, but it was safe. I worked 2 jobs through high school, stocking shelves and seasonal yard work. Liam struggled too. Kids bullied him for living in someone's basement until one day he fought back and got suspended. I was proud he stood up for himself. We never heard from Mom, but her cousin Maya visited once a year, bringing news. That's how we learned their perfect life abroad collapsed in less than a year. Edward lost his job, and they moved 3 hours away. Mom had another child with him, a boy, which hit Liam hard. After I graduated barely passing, I found warehouse work. Liam, 15 then, started a part-time job too. We scraped enough for a small apartment. I pushed him to focus on school. He earned a partial scholarship to college, aiming for medicine. For years, Mom was nothing but a ghost. Then one Tuesday, Liam called during work, urgent. He sent me screenshots of messages from her. After 10 years of silence, she needed something. Her youngest son had kidney disease, and none of them were matches. She wanted Liam tested. We saw our chance. Liam kept her talking without committing, while I dug into Edward's business. He was expanding, looking for new property. Perfect. I found a building with hidden structural problems and lined him up for the deal under my middle name. Meanwhile, Liam met Mom at a cafe. She begged for help, hiding it from Edward, who still called us parasites. She sent full medical records in desperation. Within days, Edward signed the lease without inspection, locking himself into a costly disaster. Liam arranged to visit their house, introduced as a friend's son. He met the sick boy, pale, 16, clearly unwell. The other kids eyed him strangely. Mid-dinner, Edward took a call about the property's black mold and huge remediation costs. Furious, he returned to the table, then froze, realizing Liam's identity. When Liam confirmed, Edward exploded, flipping the table and calling us parasites. The sick boy looked shocked. The older kids filmed the chaos. Liam calmly reminded him of the day they burned our belongings. Edward denied it, until Liam played the video from our old neighbor. Silence fell. The sick boy cried. Edward lunged for Liam's phone, but Liam warned he had copies and mentioned the lack of a statute of limitations on child abandonment here. Edward threw him out. Mom chased him, begging about the kidney. Liam said he might consider it, but only under conditions. Now Edward faced a collapsing business, cracks in his perfect family image, and 2 sons he couldn't control. For the first time in 10 years, the power was in our hands, and we weren't done yet. Edward didn't know yet that I was the one behind the property deal, and that made every move feel sharper, like playing a game of chess where I already had him cornered. Liam and I spent the next few nights refining our plan, working in the dim light of my kitchen while takeout boxes piled up on the table. He had the patience for gathering information, the way he could keep Mom talking without giving her anything real in return, and I had the connections and experience to hit Edward exactly where it would hurt. The medical situation gave us leverage we hadn't had before. Mom's desperation made her reckless, talking to Liam behind Edward's back, sending details she should have kept close, and trying to guilt him with pictures of the sick boy looking pale and small in a hospital gown. Every time she messaged, I felt that same mix of anger and cold calculation. Anger for what they'd done to us, calculation because this time we were the ones steering the direction. A few days after the dinner blow-up, I learned through one of my warehouse contacts that Edward was scrambling to secure financing for the building he'd leased. The remediation costs for the mold were higher than even I had guessed, and his investor had started asking hard questions about whether the expansion made sense at all. It was the perfect time to press harder. Liam, meanwhile, was digging into the step-siblings. He started following them on social media from a clean and used account. He wasn't just looking at their posts. He was reading comments, seeing who they interacted with, mapping the circle of people who still believed in Edward's perfect family narrative. The more we saw, the more cracks appeared. The oldest daughter, Mia, posted vague quotes about loyalty and betrayal. The middle one, Drew, seemed angrier, writing long captions about trust being broken. It was almost too easy to guess they'd been talking about the dinner. One evening, around 10, Liam called me with something new. Mia had posted a photo of her and Drew at a coffee shop with the caption, "Sometimes the truth hurts, but it's better than living in lies." She'd tagged a location just a few blocks from their house. We didn't know if it meant anything concrete, but it told us they weren't buying their parents' version anymore. That was an opening we couldn't ignore. The next day, I drove to Edward's business location. I didn't go inside, just sat in the car across the street and watched. The man who had once stood in our backyard with a gas can and a smirk now walked out of his office looking 10 years older than he should, shoulders hunched, phone pressed tight to his ear. Even from the car, I could see the frustration in his face, the way he waved his free hand like swatting at invisible flies. I wanted him to feel smaller every day, to understand what it meant to lose control piece by piece. That night, Liam got a message from an unknown account. It was Drew. No preamble, no hesitation, just a blunt line. "Is it true they left you behind?" Liam waited before replying, keeping his tone short but honest. "Yes, and there's proof." Drew's next message came within minutes. "Send it." We decided to hold back for now. If they wanted the proof, they'd have to meet us in person. By Friday, Edward's situation had shifted again. A contact in commercial real estate told me that one of his backers had pulled out completely after reviewing the building's inspection report. That kind of loss wasn't just inconvenient. It was a hole in the ship, the kind that made water rush in faster than you could bail it out. The idea of him pacing in his office, realizing every decision he'd made was stacking against him, kept me up that night in the best way. We decided to split our focus. Liam would arrange to meet Drew and Mia under the guise of answering their questions. I would accidentally cross paths with Edward somewhere public, where he couldn't explode without people noticing. If he recognized me before I was ready to reveal myself, I could still use my middle name, keep him off balance. But if the timing felt right, I'd let him know exactly who I was. The meeting with the older kids happened first. Liam met them in a quiet corner booth at a small diner, choosing a place far enough from their neighborhood that they wouldn't risk running into anyone they knew. They were nervous at first, glancing around like they were being watched. When Liam finally slid his phone across the table and pressed play on the video, Mia covered her mouth, and Drew swore under his breath. They watched in silence until the end, the flames lighting up the frame, Mom's laugh sharp as glass. Edward's voice telling us to walk to foster care. When the video ended, neither of them spoke right away. Drew finally asked why we hadn't come to them sooner, and Liam told the truth. We didn't trust anyone connected to Edward. Mia said she'd suspected something for years, but had never imagined it was that bad. They both agreed not to tell Edward they'd met with us, and for the first time, I saw the possibility of turning his own children against him completely. The next afternoon, I got my chance with Edward. I walked into the upscale cafe where I knew he sometimes held business meetings. He was alone at a table, laptop open, papers spread out in a way that made him look busy, but the tightness in his jaw told me he wasn't winning whatever battle was on the screen. I ordered a coffee and positioned myself at the next table over, making sure he noticed me without making direct eye contact. It took less than 5 minutes for him to close the laptop and glance my way. He studied me for a moment, like a name was hovering just out of reach in his mind. "Do I know you?" he asked finally. I smiled, a calm, slow smile that I knew would itch at him long after I left. "Maybe," I said. "It's been a long time." He didn't push it then, but I saw the unease in his eyes. That was enough for the moment. I finished my coffee, stood, and left without another word. Sometimes the smallest cracks were the ones that split the whole wall later, and Edward had just heard the first one. That night, Liam and I went through everything again. The business trouble, the shifting loyalty of his kids, Mom's desperation, the growing pressure from every side. We didn't know exactly when the breaking point would come, but we could feel it getting closer. The difference this time was that we weren't the ones being cornered. We were the ones holding the match. The morning after the cafe encounter, I woke up with the kind of clarity that doesn't leave room for hesitation. Edward was teetering on the edge, and the right push would send him straight into the fall. Liam and I knew it had to be timed perfectly. Too soon, and he might have room to recover. Too late, and he might find a way to claw himself out of the hole. We weren't going to give him that chance. Liam's connection with Drew and Mia was proving to be more valuable than we'd hoped. They were both texting him now, asking questions, digging for details about the day we were left behind. We fed them enough truth to keep them hooked, but not so much that they'd run to Edward and give him a warning. Drew seemed angrier with each message. Mia was quieter but sharper, the kind of quiet that told me she was thinking long-term. She asked for the proof in writing, and when Liam sent her still frames from the video, she didn't even hesitate before replying. He's never going to be able to talk his way out of this. Meanwhile, Mom's messages to Liam were becoming frantic. She'd moved past polite requests into full-blown begging, piling guilt on top of desperation. She told him the boy's condition was deteriorating faster than expected, that dialysis was only buying time. The more desperate she got, the more reckless she became. She sent Liam copies of test results, details about hospital appointments, even her own complaints about how Edward was too proud to reach out to us himself. That one made me laugh. It wasn't pride. It was the fact that admitting he needed anything from us would mean acknowledging we existed. By Thursday, I decided it was time to move from the shadows into his direct line of sight. I went to his business again, but this time I didn't linger outside. I walked straight in, past a receptionist who looked startled, and stopped in front of his office door. I knocked once, then opened it without waiting for an answer. Edward looked up from his desk, confusion giving way to irritation. "Can I help you?" he said, his tone flat, but his eyes narrowing. I stepped in, closed the door behind me, and took my time before answering. "You could say that," I told him, letting the words hang in the air until he shifted in his chair. His gaze sharpened, and I knew he was searching his memory for where he'd seen me before. I didn't give him the satisfaction of helping. Instead, I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket and placed it on his desk. It was a highlighted section of his lease agreement, the part that locked him into paying for the building's repairs in full. He read it once, then again, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice low. I smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You already know," I said, and watched the realization crash over him. His face went pale, then red, then something in between. He pushed back from his desk, so fast his chair hit the wall. "You," he said, like the word tasted rotten. "You're the other one." I didn't flinch. "The one you called a parasite. The one you told to walk to foster care." His hands clenched into fists on the edge of the desk, but I kept going. "And now I'm the one who made sure you signed that lease without knowing what was inside. Call it balance." He started shouting then, a stream of insults mixed with threats about lawyers and lawsuits. I stayed calm, leaning against the wall like I had all the time in the world. When he paused for breath, I told him about the video. I told him it was backed up in multiple places and that the people he did business with would be very interested to see how he treated family. The color drained from his face again, and for a moment, he didn't speak at all. "You think you're smart," he said finally, voice shaking. "You think you've won." I leaned in just enough for him to feel it. "I don't think it. I know it. And this is just the start." I turned to leave, and that's when he lost control. He picked up a heavy stapler and hurled it at the wall beside me. It hit with a sharp crack, pieces scattering across the floor. I didn't even turn around. I just walked out, letting the slam of the door be the last word. Outside, my phone buzzed. It was Liam, and his voice was tight when I answered. "He knows," he said. "Drew just called me." Edward's storming around the house, yelling about betrayal, and Mom's crying in the kitchen. It was happening faster than we'd planned, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Pressure works best when it's constant. That evening, Drew and Mia came to see us in person. They'd driven themselves, parking 2 streets over so no one would notice their car. They brought a flash drive, saying they'd gone through some of Edward's old emails and found messages between him and Mom from before the move. They were worse than I'd imagined. Calculations of how much money they'd save without us. Back and forths about whether dumping us on relatives would be easier than dealing with us directly. One line from Edward stood out so clearly I could still hear it hours later. "They'll survive. Kids always do." I didn't tell Drew and Mia how close that had come to being wrong. I didn't tell them about the nights Liam cried himself to sleep on a stranger's couch, or the mornings we skipped breakfast because there wasn't anything to eat. But I saw something change in their faces as they read the words for themselves. Whatever loyalty they'd had left for Edward snapped in that moment. Before they left, Drew said something I didn't expect. "If there's anything I can do to help you end this, I'm in." It wasn't just anger in his voice, it was conviction. That made me pause. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about dismantling the story Edward had built and making sure everyone knew it for the lie it was. The next day, we started phase 3. Liam strung Mom along, agreeing to meet her at a hospital cafe to talk about next steps for the kidney. She was all smiles when he walked in, like the last decade hadn't happened, but he kept his tone flat. He asked her straight out if Edward knew about their meeting. She admitted he didn't and begged him not to tell. That was the confirmation we needed. She was willing to keep secrets from him if it meant getting what she wanted. While Liam was with her, I was at a meeting with one of Edward's business partners. I didn't have to work hard to get him talking. He was already frustrated about delays and unexpected costs from the building deal. I kept my questions careful, just enough to steer him toward the right conclusions without making my involvement obvious. By the end of the meeting, I knew Edward's financial breathing room was almost gone. When Liam got back, he handed me a copy of the boy's full medical report, courtesy of Mom's desperation. I didn't like using the kid's illness as leverage, but I reminded myself it wasn't about him. It was about the people who had decided our lives were disposable. The more we knew, the more control we had. By the time the weekend rolled around, Edward's world was beginning to shrink. He was losing money, losing allies, and now, without even realizing it, he was losing his own children's loyalty. Liam and I could feel it. One more push, and the whole thing would start to collapse. We just had to decide how loud we wanted the crash to be. It all came to a head on a Monday morning that started out deceptively quiet. The sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that presses down on you. And for a moment, I thought maybe we'd reached the natural end of things. Edward was unraveling. Mom was on her knees metaphorically and literally, and Liam and I had done what we set out to do. But the truth was, there was still one thread left to pull, and I couldn't ignore it. The truth has a way of rotting in the dark if you leave it there, and I wanted every last lie in Edward's world dragged out into the light. The final push came from an unexpected text. It was from Drew, short and urgent. "You need to come now." There was no address, just a pin on a map. It was Edward's house. I called immediately, but Drew whispered that he couldn't talk and hung up. That alone told me something serious was happening. Liam was at the apartment, still sore from his last meeting with Mom. But when I told him, he didn't hesitate. We drove in silence, each of us running through possibilities in our heads. When we got there, Drew was waiting at the end of the driveway, his expression tight. He said Edward had just kicked Mom out again after another fight, but this time it was bad. Voices raised so loud the neighbors had come outside. Apparently, Edward had found out that Drew and Mia had been talking to us. That was the one betrayal he couldn't tolerate. Inside the house, Edward was pacing the living room, a drink in one hand, shouting into his phone. I couldn't hear who was on the other end, but the words lawsuit and fraud kept coming up. I didn't bother knocking. I stepped right inside, Liam behind me, and for a moment Edward just stared like he couldn't believe I'd walked into his home. His face went from surprise to fury in seconds. He slammed the phone down so hard the glass on the screen spiderwebbed. "You think you can just show up here?" he said, his voice rising. "After what you've done to my business, my family?" I kept my tone even. "Your family," I said slowly, "isn't yours to claim anymore. They know who you are now." His jaw clenched, but before he could answer, Mia came into the room holding a laptop. She didn't look at him. She looked at me. "You should see this," she said. She set it on the coffee table, and on the screen was an email chain from the week before we'd been abandoned. It was from Edward to Mom, laying out his plan for moving to Canada instead of France, because it would be easier to leave them behind without anyone asking questions. The them was us. I could see Liam's hands balling into fists beside me, but I kept him from stepping forward. Edward tried to grab the laptop, but Mia shut it and stepped back. "It's backed up," she said, her voice steady. "Everything is backed up now." That was when I knew whatever control Edward thought he still had over his kids was gone. We didn't need to shout anymore. The evidence was speaking for us. I told Edward that by the end of the week, every one of those emails would be in the hands of his investors, the business community, and anyone else who thought of him as a respectable man. He tried to bluster, to threaten, but the words had no weight now. His children were standing in the room, their eyes fixed on him, and he couldn't spin this into a misunderstanding. Then Liam stepped forward, pulling out a single sheet of paper from his jacket. It was the signed confession from Mom, the one admitting to abandoning us. He placed it on the table between us. "This is the truth," Liam said, his voice sharper than I'd heard in years. "And it's not going away. You can fight it, but you'll lose. You always lose when you think everyone else is as blind as you want them to be." Edward stared at the paper, and for the first time, I saw something in his face that wasn't rage. It was fear, not of us, but of what losing the story he'd told for years would do to him. His whole life was built on a version of events where he was the savior, the provider, the victim of our supposed ingratitude. Now, with a few lines of ink and a series of emails, that life was collapsing. I didn't stay to watch the full implosion. We left the house, and for the first time, Drew and Mia walked out with us. Outside, Mia handed me a small USB drive. "It's everything," she said. "Every document, every message, every piece of proof we could find." Her hands shook slightly, but her voice didn't. "Do what you need to do." We didn't waste time. That night, Liam and I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the files. There were bank statements showing Edward draining accounts to cover personal debts, records of him using company money for luxury trips, even messages to old friends bragging about how he'd cut dead weight from his life. The phrase made my stomach turn because I knew exactly who he meant. The next morning, we sent it all out. Investors, business partners, community boards, anyone who might matter to him professionally or socially. This time, we didn't just send the files. We attached a letter from both of us, outlining the truth in clear, simple language. We didn't write with anger. We wrote with precision, knowing that the facts alone were enough to burn his carefully built world to the ground. The fallout was immediate. Edward's company website went offline within hours. By the end of the week, a local news outlet had published a story about allegations of misconduct and personal abandonment against him. We hadn't even contacted the press. It had been leaked by someone else, maybe one of the investors we'd sent the files to. His name was everywhere, but not in the way he'd spent years trying to make it. Mom tried to call Liam again, this time from an unfamiliar number. He didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice thin and cracked, saying Edward was gone, the house was being repossessed, and she didn't know where to go. She said she was sorry, but the words sounded hollow, like she was saying them because she thought it might buy her something. And then, just when I thought it was over, Liam did something I hadn't expected. He told me he'd gotten the results. He was a match for the boy. He was going to go through with the donation. I asked him if he was sure, if he wanted to do anything for a family that had left us to rot. He said it wasn't for them. It was for the kid, who had never made a choice in any of this. The surgery happened 2 weeks later. Mom tried to visit the hospital, but Liam refused to see her. The boy recovered quickly, and Liam went home sore but steady. We never told Edward about the donation. Let him think we'd refused. Let him live with the idea that his son's survival had nothing to do with us. Months later, I got one last message from Mia. It was just a photo of Edward sitting alone in what looked like a cheap motel room, staring at the wall. No caption, no explanation. I didn't need one. The empire he'd built on lies was gone. The audience for his stories had turned their backs. and all he had left was the echo of his own voice. I stared at that picture for a long time before deleting it, not out of forgiveness, but because I realized we'd already won. We didn't need to keep him in front of us anymore. We had lives to live, and for the first time in a decade, they were ours entirely. The past was still there, but it wasn't steering the wheel anymore. We were.